So to pick up where we left off on the tillage and the primary tillage, where we're talking about the moldboard plows, and there are a couple different styles of moldboard plows that you can have. One could be an integral, which is basically just a 3-point hookup, and then the weight of that tractor, the weight of the implement, we basically lower it down to the ground. That's how it does that inversion tillage there. Could be a semi-integral. That's where we have a 3-point hookup, but then there's also a tire that's going to help kind of guide that, make sure, we kind of maintain the depth. It's going to help support it. You could typically have, something that's a little bit longer on the end with those, or a bigger plow. But again, you're going to need a bigger tractor to be able to do that. You could have one that's drawn, which is hooks up to the drawbar. We don't need as much weight on that tractor. Sometimes these moldboard plows can be pretty heavy. And so you need to make sure that you ballast it out correctly if you're lifting those things up directly in the air. So the drawbar ones, okay, again, you're going to need the tractor to pull it because these things do get a lot of resistance. You'll notice a lot of these don't really have a whole lot of plows on them. They may have 4 or 5 of them, and it doesn't seem like that much. The pass, isn't going to be that much, but you're completely flipping the soil over in that pass, and that takes quite a bit of energy, quite a bit of horsepower. And they could be a reversible or a two-way, that hooks up to a 3-point, and that allows you to actually go in both directions. So you go down that field instead of deadheading and going all the way back around. What you end up doing is basically flipping that with hydraulics, and then you can go in that reverse direction. When we're working with a moldboard plow and actually turning that soil over, you want to make sure that it's always going in the same direction. And if you turn around, the plow is going to be facing the opposite directions. And so the reversible ones, typically the ones you see more often than anything. A lot of people have kind of gotten away from using the moldboard plows just because of the sheer energy that it takes. It is really effective, but especially with the conservations, the no-till, the strip-till, those types of processes have really kind of eliminated the need for these things. But people still do use them. It really depends on the operation and what we're looking for. We can take a moldboard plow and we can do kind of one of two ways. We can hitch it well, depending on the style of the moldboard plow, it's either going to be an in furrow, meaning that that tire is actually going to be driving in the furrow from the last pass that we made. And then that's going to set us up, make sure that we keep it in the same distance, or it could be an on land one. That means where all the tires are basically on the untouched land that we're driving. And that moldboard plow is basically hitting that stuff behind that tractor and just off to the side. With the on-land one, typically you're going to use GPS. With an in-furrow one, you don't need to because that rut of that furrow is going to help keep that tire. It's going to guide that tire, make sure that we keep straight lines. Typically, these things are done at about 4 to 6 miles per hour, like most operations. The pattern that we typically do is we work from one end and we go to the other. We're not trying to, skip spots or do anything. If you think about like that ripping video that we watched, that one, they were kind of like bouncing back and around to get that tractor to turn. On these ones, we're basically turning these things around and we're working right next to the other pass. So you'd pick, the start at one end of the field, and then you work over on the other side. And the two-way rollover, that has to do with that, the one that can actually just kind of flip and kind of rotate back and forth. Typically, when we're going through and we're ripping fields, we might need to level the field for our irrigation, especially if we don't have any kind of, sprinkler irrigation or drip line irrigation. Leveling a field is incredibly important when you're doing, flood irrigation stuff. And so typically what we'll see, I'm going to move this out of the way. You'll see a little triplane right here. And these things you could see, we've got, kind of wheels in the back, wheel in the front. And there's a little scraper blade that's in the middle. What this thing does is, because it covers such a long distance, and as we're pulling this thing through, we're able to actually get this thing to, level off, field. So if you have high points, it's going to scrape that dirt off, and then it's going to drop that dirt in the low points. We typically do a crisscross pattern and then kind of, in line, with it. We go in a lot of different directions. We want to make sure we're working that soil and we're getting that field level. This typically doesn't have like any GPS units or anything like that. We do have scraper blades that you can, use with GPS, and it'll actually lift that bucket up and down. With this one, it's, pretty basic. It just uses the length to essentially level those things off. So that field is going to be level in comparison to, the other parts of the field that the tires are actually on. It's an effective way to kind of level a field and get it pretty close. There you can see a Schmeiser triplane that we have. You can see the wheels that are in the back, kind of solidify that, kind of hold those things in place. But it's that distance that really gets it to kind of level itself over, over that long distance there. Um, so when you're working with this, and really any kind of bucket work that we're kind of doing, whenever you're working this, you do want to fill up that bucket. So you may be kind of cutting down a little bit of soil, and you want that to kind of maintain. You want to have about half to three quarters, so that way when the soil does kind of drop underneath there, that soil is going to kind of filter in and allow that to fill in. If you don't have anything in that bucket, if you hit highs or if you hit low spots, it's not going to fill anything in. So balancing out a field, you really kind of have to, understand where is this field at? Do we have our high spots? Where's our high spots? Grabbing those things and then kind of moving that dirt into our low spots that we have. And this is not necessarily something that's going to happen all the time, but it is something that we are going to do. Here you can see kind of that pattern that I was talking about. We're kind of crisscrossing right here, and then we go, in all different directions. What this does is this just helps make sure that we move that soil around, that we fill it in. We don't just make one pass with these things. We make sure we make multiple passes, so that way we can, get this field as level as we possibly can. Okay, so it's removing the high spots and it's filling in the low spots. So we're cutting from one part of the field to add into another. We're not actually adding dirt into this field. We don't truck dirt into that. There may be some cases where you have to do that, but typically, if we don't really have any high spots, we have low spots, then we just kind of cut that blade down a little bit so that way we can fill those low spots. It's a balance of, kind of knowing your field, knowing where we're at, and gauging it from there. The idea is for leveling it again, so that way we can have a level field for irrigation purposes. Laser leveling a field. So you can kind of see a little example of this. This one's got a little receiver unit. They've got a little transmitter they set up. These things, basically that laser level is going to say, okay, it wants that bucket to stay at that height. It uses electronics to control the bucket. And so, if that, tractor is running and it's on unlevel fields, this bucket is going to maintain that same level. So if it kind of drops down because it's in a pit, that bucket is going to lift up and it's going to maintain that. And we're just going to be able to level this field out. Nice, perfect. Once you get it set up, then you're good to go. You don't have to mess with it. And as long as you're not tilling that soil up and, destroying that or disking it, you're really going to maintain that levelness in that field. It's not going to affect it that much. And you may not need to do that, all the time. Typically we'll level fields, if we're planting like orchards and things like that, we level it once. And then once we're done with that, then, we're good. We're not disking. We're not doing that stuff. We're not tearing up that soil, and the irrigation is going to be good. So you can see kind of an example of a little device that's out there. This thing is just basically sets off and it just sends a little laser unit. And as that tractor drives around that field, he's basically driving, doing the same thing that a triplane is, might, be going in different directions and whatnot to help, cut that field, to kind of cut the high parts and fill in the low parts. They really work kind of the same way. This one's just using a GPS unit instead of, the distance that we have. So here you can kind of see a little scraper. This one's got a little GPS unit or a little receiver unit on there to kind of help make sure we raise and lower it. You can see there's some soil inside of that bucket right there. And just getting this field nice, level, so that way we can have great irrigation. If we can't deliver the water to the plants, it doesn't do us any good. You might see like Midwest and stuff. They typically aren't going to level fields because they're using rainwater. You'll see corn planted on hillsides and stuff like that, and it grows because they get plenty of rain. That's not how we work here. We have to make sure that we get that irrigation in there, and that's really where this leveling kind of comes in. Disc plow, kind of an example of these things. This would be an example of that in furrow that we kind of talked about, where that tire is kind of riding in that furrow. You see we got a little bit of a tilt. Similar to a moldboard plow, this thing's going to have a little disc that's going to be on there. We're basically turning those things over. May not be as clean. You're going to get some crop residue that's going to be left on there. You're going to see that stuff. These things typically work a little bit better in drier soils. If we have wet soils, kind of like a ripper, it's really just going to cut right through it and just going to make like a knife blade. And it's not going to do a real good job of turning that soil over and getting there. Not a complete job. You're not going to completely, finish, everything off. You're going to see tons of different crop residues in here. Depends on what you're looking for. How much do we want? How much is acceptable to leave? Do we want this field to be nice, perfect, and clean? Or are we wasting time? Are we wasting money? And are we actually doing more harm? And that's why people kind of go back and forth, right? What do? Do we completely tear this field up? Do we do this every single year? Or do we minimize those things? Do we do it every 5 years? Do we not do it at all? We're not concerned with it. As far as those things go, like the disc plows, the scrapers, we're kind of turning the soil, the moldboard plows, right? We're turning that soil. We're kind of, exposing that, getting all that trash, which is the plant material that's in there, and we're removing that stuff from this. The other types of tillage that we kind of have would be what we consider non-inversion tillage. And so that's not when we're flipping that soil over and actually turning it and burying that crop residue. We're essentially just kind of disturbing, we're just kind of like loosening up that soil, but we're not really messing with that topsoil. We're not kind of taking it, flipping it over. You're still, if you have plant material that's in there, it will still be there. It will still be visible. We're simply just kind of tearing up that soil. We might be doing that to help plant. We might be doing it to, get rid of, some, cut the roots out of plants. There's a lot of different operations, a lot of different things. Kind of gets into a little bit more of like secondary tillage as well, which we're going to get to on the next PowerPoint. A little chisel right here. You could see these things. You may have seen these before. These little chisels, right? We've got these little feet that are essentially on there. Those things go down into the ground, and they're basically going to be just breaking up that soil. You may have a whole bunch of these. You may have plants that you're going through and you're not wanting to dig that deep. Chisels can both be primary tillage, and we'll get into the secondary tillage. It really depends on how deep we're wanting it to go. But these things are just kind of shattering it. Notice there's little springs on these things. Those springs are designed to kind of get a little bit of an action. Sometimes the metal is just kind of bent in like a circular kind of, shape, and that metal kind of has some springiness to it. And so as it's going through the field, all those little forks are just kind of moving back and forth, and it's just kind of, chopping up that soil, breaking up that soil to make sure that we have that air within there. You can see a little Colta plow right here. Some of these things, the names are interchangeable, right? If we think about like a chisel, you think about a Colta plow, it's really doing the same things, right? We're just we're not flipping that soil over, but we're breaking up that soil. We're loosening that stuff up. Any kind of, hard pack or anything like that. We want to make sure we break those up so we get good aeration. Schmeiser chisel plow, you can see that, right there, right? We have these things, they're kind of separated, alternating. They're not necessarily right next to each other. In some cases, you may have a lot. In some cases, you may be, if you're doing it in a vineyard, you only really want to do that middle. You're not trying to do right next to the trees or right next to the vines. You're just trying to break up that center portion there. So we're going to stir, we're going to aerate that soil. Okay. There is some inversion, but we call it non-inversion because we're not actually taking it and flipping it all the way over. Like with a disc or like, with the moldboard plow or even the scraper, we're not actually turning that soil over. So it's going to shatter. It's going to leave it rough. Dry soil like rippers, right? That's going to be the best thing because you want that kind of shattering effect. You can work the ground up to 15 inches with these things. Okay, that's kind of where we're getting to that primary tillage. Although typically we might be more like 6 to 8 inches in depth. It's a lot faster. You can do it a lot quicker than you can with plowing because you're not inverting that soil. You can do it with a tractor that has less horsepower. You can run it at faster speed. Really depends on the soil conditions that you have, but you can kind of do that. You can get some of the similar effects that you want with getting that aeration, but not having to spend all that energy and all that time. And that's going to cost more money, and obviously that's going to increase your costs. So a lot of it is trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to happen for these plants to grow effectively, and what don't we need to do? Can we get away with just using a chisel plow as opposed to disking these things? So the soil is going to be loose. Okay. There's some trash that's mixed in. Some of it's going to be on the top. Okay. And again, trash, we refer that as plant material that we really don't want. Their crop residue is going to be on the top. Approximately about 25% will be left in with each pass. And typically we go in a cross diagonal, kind of pattern where we're going, diagonally across, and then we go across those things to make sure that we're working that soil in the different directions. We don't want to just work the same lines every single time as we're going through. And a lot of this tillage equipment, it's very similar, in that retrospect. Stubble mulch tillage. The chisel plow is ideal for stubble mulch tillage. Okay, you can retain, your surface residue. You can control erosion. That's kind of one of the biggest things that we deal with, and why we are concerned a little bit more with using like a moldboard plow or a disc. As you disc those things under, and you don't have those roots from the plant material kind of holding that soil together, as wind comes in or water kind of comes in, it can wash that soil out. And then your topsoil, that's the real rich stuff. That's where these plants are really going to thrive, where they're going to get a lot of their nutrients. And if you disc that stuff over, you can create a nice clean field. That wind comes in, it's going to blow that topsoil out. And then all of a sudden you don't have your nutrients there. Also going to kind of reduce surface evaporation. So if you have some moisture that is in there, you want to retain that. If we completely dig these things up and we expose this stuff, that the water that's inside that soil is going to evaporate really quickly. But we can kill weeds. Okay. And it does anytime you open up, soil, it's going to evaporate more water. So how much are we working it versus how much water are we going to lose? Are we going to need to have to irrigate that stuff again? Those are all things that we kind of look at and we're kind of deciding, okay, do we do this? Do we not? What else do we need to do, or what can we do in some of these instances? The types and sizes, they can vary, but basically they're going to have a frame. It's a real simple square frame most of the time. You might have one shank per foot of width, but depending on your setup and your field and what you're trying to do, you may change that. Sometimes they have folding frames that kind of have wings that are going to fold out. So if you're transporting it down the road, you can do that. And then you can kind of lay these things out and have something that's going to be 30, 40 feet wide and kind of pull it through a field. It's going to make it more effective. These things don't have a lot of resistance on them like a moldboard plow. So you're not going to have to spend or have a tractor that's got a really high horsepower. It doesn't take that much. So you can either have a high horsepower tractor that does a longer or a bigger swath width, or you can, kind of shorten it down and have a real small tractor doing it. Typically we do 2 to 6 miles per hour. We do real tight turns. So we work the field kind of, one line next to each other. We work those things across as we're going through that field. On chisels, we do have different shanks. The ones that you've kind of seen has just been a straight blade. This one's actually reversible. So as this one wears down, because it is going through that soil, you can actually flip and rotate it and use this one. Once both sides are wear out, you buy a new one. But we do have different kind of wings that are here. Different kind of wings. This is going to work the soil a little bit more, a little bit less. Some of these, like this one, is kind of more considered like a lister. But it really looks, kind of depends on what you're looking for and what we want to do. Here's an example of a lister or a furrower or a furrowing bar. These things are going to actually create the furrows and the little raised beds that you're going to be working with if you're going to be planting. Sometimes we might be planting on a flat ground. Sometimes we actually want to create those furrows so that way water will run down. The plant's going to be up on the top side here. So these furrowing bars, we are allowed to kind of make the rows and the divots for the water and for the plants to kind of grow into. And obviously that's going to be for irrigation. You may do this if it's a drip irrigation, but you may do it if it's a flood irrigation. It really kind of depends. Your drainage is going to be really good. You don't have plants that are sitting in that water because they're going to be planted up on that hill or that berm that we create. But they're allowed to get that water that they need. So that drainage is a little bit better. You get good aeration. You get a deeper root zone with that because you're actually taking that soil and you're building it up. And so we're planting that plant on top. And so your root zone, with that good topsoil is a little bit deeper. And then you can also do some cultivation with that, especially when we get into the secondary tillage. That's when we deal a little bit more with cultivation. Mechanical harvest, right? You got these nice rows, you got things there, and it often improves yield in these fields. When we do these things, you can kind of see some examples of the furrows there and the berms where we're going to be planting. And you can see that typically we're going to use a GPS to make sure that we're accurate, to make sure that we have straight rows. It's going to allow you to make sure you have every single row possible. If we kind of don't use GPS and we kind of veer a little bit, you may lose a couple of rows, and that's all production. So typically your yield is going to be higher, especially when we introduce the GPS unit on the inside of these things. These things have markers and they kind of help guide you to make sure that you're, keeping these things, the right distance. And you can kind of look at those. You can see these little wings that are kind of heading out here. I think in the next slide, we kind of see a little bit of those markers as well. And you can kind of see that's going to be where you want to put that next one there. So if you don't have the GPS, we use those little markers there, and that's going to indicate, hey, this is kind of where our next row is going to be. This is where we're going to set things up there. Helps make sure you maintain that. So they set up the row spacings, they lay it out, they create the furrows, right, for the irrigation. They create that seed bed that's going to help, when we plant our seed up into there. You can get these things, set up. You can do it in the wintertime. You can leave them set up and then you can plant, a little bit earlier with these things set up there. Toolbars are going to be vary in size. Okay. We can You know, it really depends on what type of tractor you have, how big it's going to be. Even the furrows can be in different sizes, but they're big, large wings like we've kind of looked at. Typically, these things are hooked up with a 3-point hitch most of the time. You might have some drawbars, but a 3-point hitch is most of what you see. They run 3 to 6 miles per hour. And again, like everything else that we've really talked about, you work one edge and you work across. You're not going to work diagonally with these things, because if you work diagonally, then you're basically creating your furrows and stuff. So this is going to be after you do your disking and ripping and all that kind of stuff. And then you'll kind of take it and then you'll put that lister through that field. And again, GPS is probably the most common method that you see nowadays because it's a little bit easier. This is kind of another way, that we can, open these things up. We can kind of create some furrows here with these little, they're kind of like disc blades, I guess, but they're not a lister. We're not taking that blade and kind of pushing that soil out. We're simply taking this stuff and we're just going to cut that soil out, but we're going to create little beds here. This one looks like it's in a cotton field that they're going through. So just another way for us to kind of, set up furrows, set up beds for these plants here. I think what we're gonna do is move on. I might just do this in one video so that way we can get it done. Is the secondary tillage here. And so we'll change this stuff over. So when we talk about secondary tillage, it's pretty similar, and there might be some similar things like the cultivators or the tillage or the chisels that we were kind of looking at. Really kind of similar. A lot of the equipment's similar, so we're not going to go through a whole lot of that. But just understand that secondary tillage is less aggressive than primary tillage. And that range, right, we're going to be working that equipment, in the ground less than 5 inches. That range could vary, okay? It's not necessarily the same. It's not necessarily going to be the same on everything. It really depends on, kind of what we're looking at there. I should probably share the screen here again, because I think I stopped doing that. All right, there we go. So it's going to be less aggressive than primary tillage, right? We're typically going to be working about 5 inches or less on the soil. So we're not doing that deeper kind of stuff. We're not working with that. We use to prepare fields for planting, for summer fallowing, for incorporating chemicals. We might do that and actually add some fertilizers, or we might add some pesticides. We might add something into there. We can do it for weed control. We can just basically cut weeds out, especially if we have furrows and different things. We can set up our chisels to be working where the plants aren't at, or like, let's say if it's corn, not in the corn row, but in between those rows, it'll basically just cut those things out. The use of GPS really helps with those types of things. We could be disking. It could be disking. Obviously, you're going to do that before you have your plant stuff. Could be field cultivators, and you're going to be doing these operations when the plants are actually planted. They're growing to help maintain the weeds. The nice thing with tillage like this, if you're running like a chisel through a field to basically cut out the plants, it's cheap. It's a lot cheaper than chemical stuff. Chemicals are not cheap. You basically take your cultivator, you run it through that field. You've already got your tractor. If you're spraying, you're going to be running that tractor anyway. It doesn't take high horsepower tractors because we're not working that ground real deep at all. And sometimes we do a combination of tillage equipment. So we're going to make one pass and we're going to do a lot of different things in just one pass. And we could have some harrows. I'll show you what some harrows kind of look like a little bit later. So tandem discs, okay, same incorporation of crop residues, that you have on primary tillage. We're just not going really deep. We're not really kind of working that stuff. Discs are going to be a little bit smaller. They're not going to be as large. And typically what you want with these things is a nice smooth surface to help prep for planting. So you want to do this before you plant. If you plant and then do this, it's going to screw everything up. That would be bad. You don't want to do that. We call these things finishing discs. So we might go through and do, a disc that's got like stubble things. It's got real, kind of notches on the disc blades. That's really going to be really aggressive, get real deep. It's going to chop up any kind of trash that's in that field. With a finishing disc, when we're dealing with secondary tillage, we don't have that. The discs are going to be smooth. They're not going to be as big because we're not working that ground as deep. And we're going to get that nice smooth surface. These things, if we're working with a tandem disc, they don't leave dead furrows. And we can just kind of work it one way and work it back the other. Like most operations, we're about 4 to 7 miles per hour when we're doing this. Field cultivators, okay, we do not like incorporate the crop residue into that ground. We are simply basically trying to cut that. So if we have like a weed that's growing in that field, we basically are going to cut that weed off. That weed's going to be laying in the field. We're not trying to bury it. We're not trying to cover it. We're simply just trying to cut the roots from the top part of the plant, so that way that plant dies. When we make that separation, the plants are just going to sit there. They're going to decompose in that field. We're not too concerned about it, especially if we get it early before the plants are big. It does break up the soils, okay, but it doesn't really typically go into fine particles. We're not trying to, crush it, pulverize or anything. There are different things that we do to help get that there. But it does open up that ground. It aerates that soil. So just like the primary tillage ones, we've got those. We've got coil shanks, vibra shanks. We've got spring tooths. These things are all just different styles of, cultivators or chisels that we can have on these things, like disking, okay, or finishing disking. It's 4 to 7 miles per hour. Spike tooth and tine tooth harrows. Okay, these things are going to be breaking up into finer particles because there's going to be more of them. It's going to help smooth that soil out. And typically we're going to put those behind there. So we might have some chisels in the front, then we might have some tines or some tine tooth harrows behind these things to help break up that soil a little bit farther. This thing would work. Oh, I did do it. Okay. No, I didn't. Here, do this. Come on. My computer does not want to work right now. There we go. So we have rotary hose. Okay, that's going to open up that soil for aeration. Okay, it's going to be a flat, large coverage. You can't do it if you've got furrows or anything like that. Basically, it's a circular area. You see these a lot like in horse arenas. We use them to kind of break up that soil as the horses kind of compact them down. We typically use rotary hose, but you can use them out in a field as well. 4 to 7 miles per hour, good to go. Ring rollers, which consist of some pulverizers. Could have some different styles of these things, but typically a ring roller, you're going to have a bunch of different rings that are going to be on there. They've got little bumps or little nubs on there. It takes the big clods. It basically breaks them up. You've probably see these. We typically run them behind these discs to break up the clods that the disc makes. It helps seal in that moisture because it kind of compacts that a little bit, helps smooth that surface, get a nice, not like a flat surface, but it helps just kind of give you a level-ish kind of surface. And it works really well to kind of break up. Sometimes we plant and we'll take a ring roller by itself and we'll run it over a field to kind of help break that crust layer that forms on that soil as we get that first irrigation on there. We have crumblers. These things are going to be used typically behind chisels and rippers. They're going to be a little bit larger. They're going to break up really big clods. They're going to be kind of heavy in nature because they need that weight to basically break those things up. But they're going to do very similar stuff for what the ring roller is going to do. Here's an example of a rotary hoe. So you see these things, right? These things, there's no power into these things. These they almost look like little spiders, but they just basically, as you're driving this thing in the ground, these things are just breaking it up. You'll see soil kind of getting kicked up, as it's going through the field. But we're just basically breaking that soil up, getting any plant material, any weeds or anything like that that's grown. We basically just want to take them, pull them out of the ground. We're not incorporating it into it. We're not, doing that inversion tillage. We're simply just basically cutting them off their roots or pulling the roots out of the ground. And once they do that, these plants are going to end up dying. Here you can see kind of a little action shot of that soil that's getting kicked up, but it just kind of, kicks that ground up. It's not a level surface. We're not, trying to get it real smooth. We're just trying to break out any plant material that's there. Big example of a crumbler. This is technically primary tillage because we're ripping, but crumblers, you can see that big bar right there. They kind of have a little spiral. That blade, as it turns around, it just breaks those big clods up as we start to work it and make sure that we don't have anything that's left. Another example of a little crumbler that's on the back, right? It's just going to kind of press those things down, make sure that we don't have anything that's too large. You do see some of these. Sometimes these are kind of like the rotary hose where they're going to spin around. These things are going to break up big clods. There's no power to these things. They're simply just going to rotate freely as we're driving these things down. And it helps cut those clods up as we're working. The crumblers that you see here, they're typically going to be behind something. So you might have a chisel, you might have a ripper blade, and it's going to be on the back to help break those things up. So when you see these crumblers, that's typically what we have. Back here, you can see an example of a little ring roller. In the next slide, I'll show you. It's got a better picture of it. But we'll have a disc and we have that ring roller, and it just helps kind of smooth that stuff out. Make sure you don't have that real rough surface. This is typically what you see as far as a ring roller goes. You can see the kind of spikes that we have. Those things help tear it up. They just rotate around a drum. The one thing with these that you do see sometimes is these things are made out of cast iron. So they can be very brittle. And if people are running these things down the road, it can be really, kind of hurt these things. And you'll see these things just kind of break off. Sometimes you see them to where there's some missing. They just kind of free float on this bar behind there, and they just they move back and forth as we're running it. But we got to be careful if we're running them on the road because that hard stuff will basically crack these cast iron stuff, especially if it's kind of bouncing a little bit. They'll crack, they fall off, and then you've got to replace them, which sometimes they wear out and you got to replace them, but we want to avoid that as much as possible. The nice things with these ring rollers that we have is that you'll notice we've got some furrows and some planting, some beds there. These things, they're kind of loosely fitted around that pipe. And so what happens is they kind of conform to the ground that they are working with. So you can theoretically use them with stuff that has unlevel ground. This is just a ring roller by itself. This is where we would go through and we drag this through a field after we planted, after we irrigated it. We're really not digging that soil. We're only working, maybe, an inch, maybe, less than that of that ground. And all we're trying to do if we take these things to run it over a field after planting is we're just trying to, break that soil up to make sure that that plant has the best opportunity for it to germinate. We can also take this one, we can hook it to the back of a disc blade as well. So you can hook that pin to a tractor, or you can hook it to the back of a disc blade and get it to smooth those things out. This is a spring tooth harrow here. You can see the curvature of the spring teeth right here. That allows these things to basically have a shattering effect. So as we drag it, it kind of gets some resistance in that field. As it pulls it back, that resistance becomes too great and it basically flings it forward. And it just does that the whole time. All these little fingers right there of those spring tooths, those are essentially just bouncing back and forth, creating that shattering effect that we want. Again, very similar to the primary tillage stuff, but depends on how deep we're working the soil, whether we consider it a secondary or a primary tillage. So just understand that there's a gray area in there. You can see the spring tooth, it's kind of working down to the ground, and you can see kind of the field and how it's kind of cleaning that up, kind of bringing up some of that moisture because you are kind of, messing with that soil and you're doing that. So you're bringing a little bit of moisture to the top surface, might help, with planting, but it will also evaporate that stuff as well. This one's kind of an interesting one. So this one's a spike tooth harrow. This one's got basically just spikes that come down. So they're not like a spring or anything like that. These spikes just go into the ground. We have that tractor, we drag it behind it. And they've actually got these like 55-gallon drums that are in the back. And what we do with that is we typically are just going to put some sand or some soil inside of those buckets to help create weight to make sure that this piece of equipment drops down into that ground how we want it to. So we add weight into those buckets. That's just a way for us to kind of ballast that to make sure we can actually push that stuff into the ground. Here's another example of a little spike tooth harrow. You can see it's just straight spikes, right? There's nothing springing. We're not trying to create that, breaking action, but we are aerating the soil with these things. As we're dragging them through that ground, it's basically breaking that soil up and it's aerating these things, across. Strip tiller right here. This is a really good example of a strip tiller. This one, looks like it might, it's got like some vacuum tubes on it too. I'm not sure if this thing is doing some planting at the same time. But the strip tiller is nice because it's got like a lot of different things that's kind of going on. It might be fertilizer maybe that we're adding into this as well. I think it's a fertilizer. I don't think it's a seed. But you can see kind of as we go through, you see the rest of this field, right? We've got all this plant material here. We're not basically removing it. We're not disking it. We're not ripping it. We're simply taking the strip tiller through that field. And you notice we have these rows that are nice and clean. And then we have these rows that aren't nice and clean. Well, where we clean it, that's where we're going to plant. These seeds, a lot of the time, they don't need that whole field to be nice and clean. They just need the area that they're in. Once they get established, once they grow, you're going to overtake this. You're not going to see these things. We will tend to just kind of rotate these back and forth. As time goes by, the plant material in here is going to, break down. It's going to decompose, and it's going to be incorporated into that soil, and it's going to help that soil out. So strip tilling is kind of like the good combination from somebody who doesn't till at all to the conversion, the conventional tillage where we're basically cleaning that field out. It's a good kind of happy medium where you're still kind of doing that. You're still getting a nice clean soil. You're just not doing it across that whole field. So we're disturbing less of it. You get less erosion. It's just kind of better overall. Typically with that strip tiller, what you're going to have is a couple different things that are going to be on. You're going to have some choppers. You're going to the shank of some sort. You're going to have some choppers. This one's got some fertilizer that's basically putting it in there. You've got some conditioners that are going to, firm up that soil kind of at the end, kind of help, flatten those things out. So it's digging, it's, basically chopping it, it's breaking it, it's doing all these different operations in one. Some of the advantages that you have is you don't have to have a tractor that's got a really high horsepower because you're only taking a small strip. You're not doing the full width of that field. So as you're working it, you're only working parts of the field that you actually need to work. Kind of another example of a multi kind of tool. We're basically creating some beds. The beds are kind of already did. So we've kind of gone through with the lister there. We've created the beds, but we want to create a nice flat surface. And so we go back through, we kind of tear, some of these things up. We help aerate it. We've got these little rollers out in the back that gives us a nice kind of flat surface that we're going to be able to plant on. You may be planting two, plants next to each other. It may be just one, depends on what you're looking for. After we have emergence or after we have that germination, okay, we still are typically going to do some tillage, cultivation. That's when we're going to take these different things to basically cut the roots out, but maintain the plants that we have. Typically weeds, they're only going to germinate in the upper 2 inches of the soil. Okay. So we don't need to go real deep with that stuff. As long as we're hitting this before the plants really get to, that point where they're established, we can really kind of maintain the weeds that are in the field to make sure that we're growing the crop we want and not stuff that we don't. We try to avoid that deep, cultivation because we don't want that moisture to be lost. We want that moisture staying in that soil. And we want to make sure that our plants that we want have that soil, have that water there and that soil when we need it. Obviously we've kind of beat this, right? Cultivation improves aeration. Doesn't really matter what you do. Any one of these things, if you're breaking up this soil, because soil will get compacted over time, it's going to help create that aeration that these plants need. And also allow moisture to basically drop down into those things. So we can establish with these things irrigation furrows, right? We can control the weeds, okay? And it's a lot cheaper. Like I've said, it's a lot cheaper than any kind of chemical stuff that we may put on these things. So doing this post-emergence tillage really helps out. It really removes a lot of that stuff, any of that unwanted vegetation, helps break up that crust. Like I talked about with that ring roller, it increases soil temperature because you get a little bit more stuff kind of flowing and works out a little bit better. The size and the number of rows covered just kind of depends on the equipment. You could have stuff that's 40 feet wide, although that does provide transport problems. But you have things that can kind of fold up and kind of modify. But you got to think about those types of things when you're doing it. So we could be working 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, right? We could go up to 40-inch rows, and we can have 6 of those, 7 of those. Okay. Could be a 9-row cultivator. Okay. That really depends on, what you're looking for, what the operation and what stuff you're planting. So the larger cultivators require much stronger toolbars on them. So if you have a toolbar that's got really long rows or it's got a lot of equipment on there, you can't just use a really small bar. Some of these things you might have like a 2-inch solid piece of steel, and that might be fine. But if you get too wide or you're getting too much resistance in that thing, even that 2-inch bar, that's a solid thick steel, it can still bend on you. And so sometimes you go with like a, 4x4 tubing. We go with a 6x6 tubing or an 8x8 tubing. And that's going to increase that strength and create more resistance to that thing kind of bending. And how we design the frame and all that kind of stuff too makes a difference. We have, on these things, we could have, rolling shields, right? Stocks and residue. We could have S-tines on here. We could have chisel plow shanks. Standards, which are just shanks that are, straight coming down. We could have spear points, could be doubles, could be shovels. Could be rotary hoe wheels like we've seen before. It could be sweeps. The sweeps are kind of like the blades, but they're kind of like a triangle that have wings that kind of come out. We could have knives. Knives are essentially a little L shape, kind of like if you think about like a hula hoe, if you've ever used one of those things where it's got that kind of opening and you drag it on the ground and it basically goes just subsurface just a little bit and it cuts the roots out. Knives are going to do the same thing, except instead of having that round portion, it just has a blade that comes out and goes right underneath that soil, right underneath the surface, and it just cuts those roots straight from the top of the plant there. Um, How we hitch them typically could be 3-point mount. You could have something that's front mount. You could have something that's mid mount. Typically, those ones are a little bit older though. Each tractor is going to be a little bit different with the lift and the draft limitations on how far these things are going to be allowed to go in the ground. And sometimes we have stabilizers, that are on the toolbars. And I think I've got some pictures, maybe not on this slide, maybe the next slide. I do have some pictures of some of these things. Toolbars can be set for a variety of sizes. So the nice thing with a lot of these cultivators is if you've got like a solid bar that's on them, you can take these things and you can kind of undo the bolts that kind of clamp onto that bar, and you can set these things to whatever spacing you want. So if you have a field and you've got a certain setup, you don't have to, take a welder, cutter, and cut these things and weld these things in the places that you want. You simply just loosen those brackets up and you can move those things and get it set up how you want. Toolbars don't have an exact science. A lot of older toolbars, I said 2-inch, some of them are like 2 1/4, and it's going to be solid. Okay, it could be tubing, but a lot of the older ones are going to be solid, so that way it can help maintain the resistance that's created there. The nice thing with solid bars is that they are heavy, and they will resist that, but it can be an issue if you're trying to replace those things, and trying to take those things off. Nowadays you see more of a large rectangular tubing, so not the 2 1/4-inch bars or the 2-inch bars, but you typically are going to see like a 4x4 tubing that kind of replaces it. So the brackets and how we mount those things on are going to be a little bit different, but nonetheless you can still modify and adjust these things to whatever setup that you want. Hitch categories depend on the size of the tractor. It could be 1, 2, 3, or 4. So just your standard hitching stuff. Here you can kind of see an example. Maybe it's a little bit fuzzy, but there's 2 bolts on there and essentially like a little diamond that clamps around that square tubing and it holds it in place. If we wanted this thing be moved over, we could do that. And you can see we've got 2 sets of bars, so that way we can get a better spacing. We can separate these things out however we want. Here you can see kind of a little bit of a mid mount right here. So we're cultivating right here in the mid mount. Again, older tractors typically going to have that. We also have the rear connected to the 3-point as well. So here's a little better picture of these things. You can see these clamps. It's a solid bar. All you gotta do is just unbolt it, slide it, do it whatever you want, set them up. Typically what people do is they set up their fields, they run things a certain way, and they don't really have to mess with these things. They're not doing it every time they go into a different field. They set all their fields up. You can see these things, these shanks are going into that ground. It's basically just kind of, digging up, getting any of those plants that are there. This is what we want. Not 100% sure what this is, but that's the plant that we want. So we make sure we don't put any of those shanks in line with that. And then we basically just run these things down, and anything that's going to be in between those rows, we're basically just going to cut out and get out of there. Here's kind of a little tricycle wheel, and we have the cultivator that's underneath there. The nice thing with like a mid mount like this, or even a front mount, as opposed to the one on the 3-point, is that these things are visible to the operator. They can just look down and they can kind of see that. They can make sure they're not hitting the plants. If you have the 3-point things, to be able to do that, you have to look back, and you may struggle kind of looking forward. But typically, most of the stuff we have is all 3-point, kind of like you'd see here. On this one, this is a little sled that we're kind of cultivating. We're trying to get the weeds that are out in there. There are plants in here. The next slide will kind of show you what this one looks like. But the nice thing with this little sled that we have here, that sits on the ground. You set your shanks to whatever depth you want, and then you don't have to worry about how deep it's going. Those sleds are basically limiting your depth in conjunction with how deep those shanks are, and then you just drag this thing right across that ground. Here you can see we've got little knife blades that are, cutting that stuff out. They are really close to these plants right here. This is what we want to keep, and they're trying to cut stuff out that's in between those two rows. And so we could take these things with that sled, kind of holds them in place. Typically, those sleds are going to be in the furrows, so it's going to help kind of guide that. And those knives are essentially just cutting stuff out and making sure that there's no plant material that's growing in between here. But it is precision. It is, kind of tough. You can see kind of another example of how close these things are going. You can see where the soil is disturbed, and you can see where it's not. Right here, you can almost not see any soil that's not disturbed except for that nice row right there. But it helps keep those weeds out, and it's better. In some applications like this, you can't make a chemical spray, because if you did that, you would kill the crop that you want. And so this manual kind of cultivation is good. The nice thing with the tractors is it takes one person. You could theoretically do this with people and hand tools, but it takes a lot longer to do that. You're going to end up spending more money on labor than you would just having a tractor with a little cultivator on it that's going to cut those weeds out. Kind of another example, right? We've got two plant lines right there, and it's basically just kind of taking that soil, disking everything up. These things have little firmers that are helping firm that bed up, and then it's also just kind of tearing things out, kind of underneath. Here you can see kind of the spacing. You can see, a little bit better on where it was cut. This is where it's disturbing the soil kind of on both sides here, and this is the portion that's not. So we've only got, I don't know, 3 inches maybe of stuff that we're not doing this. GPS is a real help with this, because you could, if you're operating this, even if you have furrows and different things like that, if that tractor moves, you're going to be taking, instead of cutting the plant material that you don't want, the weeds, you could be cutting your crop out. And so GPS is definitely a huge help to make sure that we don't have any of those issues there. Here you can kind of see an example of the little, disc blades that are going to kind of open up those furrows, and the chisels, these little spring tooth ones. They're on the side. How we set these things up, these ones are essentially set up for like rows and beds. We have some out here at Fresno State that are set up for our sweet corn. As we plant that sweet corn, we can kind of chisel the beds. Sometimes we're not too worried about the furrows. We're going to take other things. We might have listers that are going to be in between these things that's going to cut those furrows out. And then you have spring tooths or the shanks that are going to be on the top. Rolling cultivator. These things are kind of like the little spider gears that we have, right? Except these things, we set them up on an angle. And what this does is it hits any plant material that's on the side of the furrows and kind of even down in the bottom, but it doesn't hit the very top where plants are going to be growing. So you can kind of see kind of another example of this stuff where it's just kind of rolling and going through. And I think there's one more slide. You can kind of see these little spider gears kind of going through. You can see a little lister right here that's essentially just pulling that dirt up, making sure that that furrow is nice and clean. It does add a little bit of soil to the top, and it kind of pulls out any weeds that are on the side right there. These things, like everything else, they're fully adjustable. You notice this bar, we've got this little clamp here. You can adjust these things to whatever size, however you want. You have that freedom and that flexibility to adjust these things. So that's the primary tillage. That's some secondary tillage stuff. I know I kind of waited a little bit, and I apologize, but hopefully you guys can get this video and you guys can learn a little bit more about that. So thank you guys, and I'll see you next week.